What if I told you in the 19th century the average American wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a Negro slave and an ancient Moor? Well, that was exactly the scenario in the early 1800s, and when Prince Al-Rahman met up with President John Adams and secured his freedom. At this time, in the European and American consciousness, the Moors were still black people that were living in their homelands, and they were still celebrating throwing these people out. And by the time we finish this video today, you will see clearly that there are many descendants of these Moors walking around in America today. And we're going to be asking ourselves once again, why do they keep changing their story? Let's get it.
I've been looking this way ever since I remember, and it ain't gonna change, so I don't care what them people say. I will forever be this way. I will forever be this way.
The story of Al-Rahman is backed up by army colonels, secretaries of states, doctors, and many eyewitnesses. Al-Rahman was a prince of the kingdom Futa Jallon, which is a Fulani type kingdom located in West Africa. Fulani people are found across Africa from east to west, all the way down to the Congo. They have since mixed in with all kinds of people in the past few hundred years, and their genomic ancestry tends to cluster more towards Central Sudanic type people and populations from Chad. Now let's get to Al-Rahman himself. The prince was born in the legendary Timbuktu, where he received his education, which we all know was a tradition. He was the rightful heir and the future king of his nation. His brother's mother was a Susu, while his mother was a Moor. If he and his brother were both here in the United States, they would have been considered Moors, because at that time, people couldn't tell the difference between a Moor and any other black person. His uncles and his cousins were famous people, and their cities were considered to have an advanced degree of civilization. Eventually, as a child, he makes it to the new capital of his father's kingdom, where he raises up to command armies. A white man arrives in his kingdom who was Dr. Cox. He was a surgeon. Citizens of his kingdom carried this man back, where he was entertained for about 6 months, and they treated him very well. And this was a turning point for the prince. Al-Rahman was a military commander, and the kingdom had been allegedly being harassed by the Igbos, and he had been sent over to fight them. He went with a group of about 1,700 men for retaliation, and he was successful against them, but eventually was taken prisoner by the Igbos. No disrespect to Igbos if y'all didn't do that. They surprised him and they pretty much ambushed him. He was sold to the Mandingos. The Mandingos turned around and sold him to a slave ship at the mouth of the Gambia. From there, he was carried over here to the United States, where he was sold to one Thomas Foster. To make a long story short, this Foster found out that his slave was an African prince, commanded armies, could read and write, and do all kind of stuff. And he also figured out that his slave was more educated than most white people at the time. When we fast forward about 20 years, this same Dr. Cox, who his family had taken care of back in the Old Kingdom, came across him here in North America. Knowing who this guy was, this creates a flurry of activity that eventually gets Al-Rahman released from slavery. Let's take a look real quick at how that happened. This same Dr. Cox attempted to get Al-Rahman out of this slavery, and he had failed that first time. He eventually gets other people involved. Including Colonel Marshall. They wanted Al-Rahman to write a letter home to see if he can get back. And so sometime around 1826, the prince sat down and wrote a passage from the Quran. Now here's the important part. When these people saw what he wrote down, they automatically assumed that he was a member of the royal family of Morocco. This is an important point of this video now. Now, we all know the Eurocentrics love to run around telling us that Morocco was a Turk Arab rather than saying who the Moors really were. And at the height of American slavery in the 19th century, these people looked at a Negro slave and assumed that he was a prince of the royal family of Morocco. Let's remember that. That tells us that they couldn't tell the difference between a Moor and any other Negro slave walking around. They would have blended right in. Now, getting back to our story, Al-Rahman had wrote down this passage from the Quran. Colonel Marshall ended up getting this passage into the hands of the United States government. What ends up happening is they forward this letter to the United States consul in Tangier in North Africa. They presented this same thing that he wrote to the Emperor of Morocco, to the Sultan, and at once the Sultan said, let this guy go, set him free, and bring him back to Morocco. Again, the Eurocentrics tell us that we never even made it to Morocco, yet somehow, some way, the Sultan of Morocco, who knew there were Negro slaves over here, said, yeah, go ahead and send that guy back. Never mind the fact that Al-Rahman never said he was from Morocco. We're going to get to that, but let's keep going. So Al-Rahman had some money sent to him to get back to Morocco, personally given to him by the Sultan. Pretty soon, the Secretary of State, Clay, recommended to the President of the United States that we should get this so-called slave back to Morocco. And by the end of the 1820s, the so-called Master Thomas Foster agreed to the release of the prince, and he received no money. He just didn't want Al-Rahman walking around as a free man in America because, this is America. It's important for us to note, once again, that the Sultan of Morocco knew that the Americans kept Negro slaves, and he still sent money anyway on behalf of Al-Rahman. Let's remember that Al-Rahman was going to meet up with the president, and this president, his father, was one of the men that signed the peace treaty with the Moroccans. So let's remember, before we get to this, that John Adams knew exactly what a Moor was. This Colonel Marshall was the authorized agent of the government and had received instructions to forward the prince to the seat of government without delay. So we see at the time that they had no problem with the black Moor. I threw up right now a general from the Napoleon Wars. If this man would have looked over his shoulder at Al-Rahman, he would have known exactly what he was looking at if he would have talked to Al-Rahman for even 10 seconds, because all the people that talked to this man knew that he was somebody. And so he ended up staying because he tried to get all his family, his children and grandchildren, so that he could take them all, but he was never able to do that. And eventually, this whole situation started to become an embarrassment to the United States government. And it was going to become even more of an embarrassment because Andrew Jackson was about to overshadow John Quincy Adams. And we all know that he wasn't having any of this stuff. Eventually, the prince gets more friends. They start appealing to Christian charities. The prince gets a letter of commendation from the Secretary of State, and he went around doing a tour of the northern cities, Philly, New York, Boston. Went to all these places, told them all his life story. They should have known by at that point that he wasn't from Morocco, but they continued to accept him as a Moorish prince anyway. And what's interesting is when he went around and did all this, they really didn't care about what he could actually tell them about Africa. They were already coming up with their own stories for Africa, so they didn't need him anyway. Eventually, in order to get money so he can get his family back, they wrote up a pamphlet featuring a short version of his life story, and he went around selling this thing, and it never was enough at the end of the story. I got my hands on the original document. Here we see it printed up for us, and I couldn't help but notice that it said that this is a statement with regard to the Moorish Prince Abdul Rahman by the guy who started the asylum for the education of the deaf and dumb. I said that is some poetic justice right there when you really look at that. The education of the deaf and dumb. So we see here a copy of the actual pamphlet. So he went around to all these places. He was known as a Moorish prince. And no time did anyone stop this man and say, hey, wait a minute, you're a Negro. How are you a Moor? Because there was no train of thought like that at the time. It wasn't until they started making Hollywood movies that these people started really doing that. But anyway, when you open up the pamphlet, the first thing that you're going to see is that he was a native of Timbuktu. Alright, it doesn't say anything in there about Morocco, although that area around Timbuktu was sometimes called Morocco. It goes on to say that he has a famous family, he was a slave for a long time, they talk in all kinds of flowery language about him. It includes all kinds of witnesses, Nathaniel Ware, Dr. Cox himself. We see what Nathaniel Ware said himself, that he lived next door to the prince and his master for 10 years and knew the worth of the prince and the truth of the above statement, meaning everything that had been said before that in the pamphlet. They even go on to say that there's even more testimony that they could have put in there, but they said everything that they had at that point was sufficient, and it was sufficient because Rahman made it into the White House to speak to the president. He even made appearances in Congress where he went to various committees. He wanted to sell his pamphlet, get a donation. He wanted to get a donation from the president for his pamphlet. The president said, no, I don't need that. I'm not going to be buying that. But if President Adams had bought that pamphlet, he would have found out much sooner that Rahman was a prince in futa, jallon, and not Morocco. In the meantime, his former master allegedly was saying if he didn't leave the United States, he would have to be a slave again. Imagine that. Imagine speaking to royalty in such a way. It makes sense to me because they were very much afraid of the slaves hearing about this stuff and getting inspired. And let's remember that they wanted to make sure the slaves couldn't read, didn't know anything, and weren't getting inspired by anybody. Getting back to Rahman, he eventually makes it to the black community where he was treated very well, and he also came across a fellow countryman, finds people from his own homeland there, including a man who fought alongside him in battles long ago. And at one time, when he was a slave, one of his former subjects recognized him and started bowing down. And I wish I could have been a fly on that wall. So what this confirms to us is that not only was he here, there are also other Fulani type people here in the United States and who continue to walk around to this day. And so eventually, of course, he's in Washington. He wants to get his family back. And so anyways, meeting with the president was ceremonious, to say the least. And so eventually they decide that instead of sending him to Morocco, they'll just send him to Liberia, and that he can make his way to wherever he needs to go from there. But unfortunately, he was never able to get all of his family back. He was only able to bring his wife and some of his kids. The rest of them had to stay here as slaves. And to this day, they still talk about his descendants. And so there are actual descendants of this kingdom, of this Moorish prince. There are actual Moors walking around in the United States today. Here we got a chart where they just go over some of the birth records of his descendants, and there's probably way more now, considering the amount of time that has passed. We see right here there are likely to be hundreds, if not thousands, of descendants. And he did have a lot of children. It says here that he had about 10 children around the year 1800. And this study identifies at least 30 people who are likely to be his grandchildren born between 1816 and 1851. And so we could take this time right now to say that Moorish royalty walks amongst us. It's time for you guys to start taking ownership of your history. Alright? The same exact Moors that were running around in ancient Spain. Let's remember that they knew exactly who those people were in those times. Let's remember that these people we're talking about had famous family members that people in the know knew exactly who these people were because they were dealing with them. And here we see in the Constitution newspaper in Atlanta, Georgia, 1888, In 1888, they were saying that the black Moors were driven from Spain. And then they go on to underscore all of this by saying that the aristocracy of Spain was held to consist of those who traced their lineage back to the time before the Moorish conquest, and that these people were whiter than those who had been mixed with the Moorish bloods. And so their blood was blue blood, while the blood of the masses was contaminated by the Moorish and showed black upon their hands and faces. That is very specific. And to this day, they continue to dress up as Moors. It's very specific the way that they dress up. Again, they dress up like this and then tell us that we're just imagining the black Moor, remember? But the fact of the matter is they still can't get over the fact that we dominated them in their own homelands and walked around doing pretty much whatever we wanted. And that's a fact. Once again, from this article in 1888, it was quite commonly supposed that the thick and dark blood was the best. And that was in the old times. The dark blood was the best, right? While the pale blood was weak and cowardly. Which goes hand in hand with what Joseph McCabe had said about the white men being a bunch of savages in ancient times. So either way, we dominated them in their own homeland. This explains why they have drawn so many pictures of us, have featured us and all kind of stuff. But you know, they always say, oh, well, it's because you're a slave and we wanted to dress you up in a costume. Which boils down to one of the reasons why they smash so much in this day and age. Is because they don't want us returning to our former positions. I keep telling people this. In real life, not on YouTube. That they don't want us to return to our former glory. So they want to make sure that we stay down. Alright? They don't want to see you ruling over them again. Let's also remember that at the height of American slavery, they were writing in their newspapers that the Moorish blood showed black on the hands and faces of the Spaniards. In the old race were the white Spaniards not mixed with Moorish blood, and the old Spaniards were the ones who were not mixed with Moorish blood. And again, we come back to full circle to what I said before, that in the 19th century, they couldn't tell the difference between a Negro slave and a Moor. And even in 1888, when the slaves were freed and they had instituted Jim Crow, a Moor was still a black person. And now you see why they didn't want anybody learning how to read. They didn't want anybody learning anything. They wanted to make sure that you stayed as dumb as possible so you didn't find this out. Remember that they were writing this stuff to each other. They weren't writing it to us. This is how they spoke to each other about us. All of this goes, and this is why it makes perfect sense to me that when we go and read the Negro slave law of South Carolina, they go on to say that a Negro is an African, quote unquote, ancient Berber. Because we are the ancient Berbers, and many other people too. So now we've reached the end of this video. We see clearly that at the height of slavery, even in the early days of Jim Crow, a Moor was a black person. They put this into their laws. We have Negroes going in front of the son of the man who helped write the peace treaty with Morocco, who looked upon this man's face and said, yep, looks like a Moor to me. Otherwise, he would have been sent right back to the plantation. And he was not. He walked around for a long time. Free in the United States. And he was not molested. As a matter of fact, subjects of Morocco could not be molested by Americans. And so I wanted to give you guys something to think about as far as the black people in America, mixed with a lot of things. There's most definitely Moorish blood mixed in. It's a direct line of descent to the very people that were in Spain for 800 years. They didn't want you to read anything, and they continued to give you a trash education to make sure that you didn't know about that. So that way you want to be white, or you want to be this, that, and the third, or you want to be embarrassed to be an African, or whatever. But if you're a sellout, I just want to tell you today that you're lowering yourself. Let's try to get away from all that and take back the history which belongs to you. Until next time.